I'm Kevin Mims with the Invading Sea, a Florida-wide media collaborative that reports on climate change in the state. As part of that effort, we've started The Business of Climate Change, a weekly interview with businessmen and women whose companies are either affected by the warming climate or address climate challenges. Today's conversation is with Brian Auld, president of the Tampa Bay Rays and secretary and treasurer of the Tampa Bay Partnership, a coalition of regional business leaders. Brian, thanks for talking with us today.
Thanks for having me. And I would just add too that I am vice chairman of the Tampa Bay Rowdies as well. It's got a facility adjacent to the sea, so I think it's relevant to this conversation.
Got it. So, Brian, as part of your work with the Tampa Bay Partnership, you chair the task force in charge of an initiative called the Business Case for Resilience. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I have. I've long thought it was a good idea for business leaders in the region to start taking a hard look at what we can do locally around climate change, and to look at it from a very business-oriented perspective. Certainly, the biggest most challenging aspects of climate change are global in nature, very obviously. But there's a lot that we can do here to prepare ourselves for at least mitigating some of the damage that I think we all know is coming, and that much of that we've already seen, in fact. So when Rick Homans was able to secure the very generous grant from J.P. Morgan Chase and asked me if I'd be willing to chair that group, I was very happy to do so.
Got it. When will the study be completed and where will you go from there?
I think we've got one more session with Alec and his team. They've been certainly leading us through it, and they're more than anything just providing us with the data that we need to best understand the situation. My hope is that when business leaders get their hands on the data and they recognize that, in layman's terms, the 5-year storm seems to be happening every year, and the 100-year storm seems to be happening every 5 years. That it will make good sense for us to start talking to our public leaders, our elected officials, and our own operations teams around what we can do to prepare our businesses and our communities for the inevitable damage that's going to come from some of those storms, some of that invading sea, to use the phrase that you guys use so often. So
Got it.
I don't know that we have specific next steps in mind yet, but I think business leaders in particular are motivated by data. They're motivated by both profits and losses. And some of this data, I think, is going to be pretty compelling when we get to really dive into it.
Got it. So, Brian, you've been with the Rays for many years and live in St. Petersburg. What kinds of climate related changes have you noticed over time just from living and working in the area?
I think those of us who live in St. Petersburg in particular, especially if you're near the water, there are more days every year that you can't take your car where you want it to go. There are more days every year that you see the water creeping up to the seawall, and those things are sort of pretty obvious. They're mostly inconveniences at this point, but they're troubling, and they're certainly indicative of a larger trend that's coming our way. I can think of at least 2 times in the last 5 years that I've packed my family in the minivan and headed north to get out of the way of incoming storms. And then, of course, I'm really proud of what the Rays have done. Not so much for our immediate and local area, but with respect to Puerto Rico and the Panhandle, who were obviously devastated by hurricanes. We've participated firsthand with feet on the ground in both those areas to try to help those communities. So we've seen what a really powerful storm can do. I think anybody living in Tampa Bay is starting to notice those things, and it's becoming more and more clear that we're better off getting in front of it than crossing our fingers and hoping it doesn't get to us.
Brian, at what point in your career did it become apparent that climate change and sea level rise would have major impacts on businesses in Tampa Bay?
I'm not sure there was a click. I grew up in a family where I very distinctly remember giving a book about 50 things that I could do to save the earth, which was simple stuff. Like I think it was turning off the water while you brush your teeth and showering a little less long. And not to suggest that those are the end all be alls, but very recently, I've certainly tried to set a personal example, and our organizations try to set a personal example by focusing on recycling, really exploring the possibilities around solar energy, doing more, uh, being more cognizant of what products you purchase and the impacts that they have. And so I'd say that, in the last 5 years or so, it's certainly been dialed up quite a bit. And I'm certainly trying to be more conscious about the decisions that I make and the impact that they have. But this is, of all the problems our planet has ever faced, and I guess this is the biggest one our planet has actually faced. it calls for collective action in a way that can be very frustrating for the individual. I can do all the composting in the world, but it's probably not going to make that big a difference. But if collectively we can really focus on reducing our carbon footprint and combating this sea level issue, we can make an impact. And that's again where I want to stress that I think this group is focused on what we can do to mitigate damage, as opposed to what we can do to actually keep the sea level from rising. Those are going to be uh, we're going to combat those really big global changes on a much larger scale than what this group's trying to do. We just want to be ready for what we can do to keep our communities in as good a condition as possible.
Brian, what can the local, state, and federal government do to help the private sector become more resilient?
Provide incentives, speak to the truth and the danger around climate change, and make this issue put it at the forefront of everyone's minds. Um, the more little things that each of us do, the more it's going to enter our lifestyles in a really material way. If there was a couple silver linings to this last year under the pandemic, we saw physical images of smog relinquishing over Los Angeles and some cities in China, and we saw the planet really starting to, it seemed like in a very material and visible way, get a little healthier for a while there. And I found that to be really hopeful and optimistic. None of us want to live through that on a daily basis, but it shows what may be necessary and what kinds of steps we may have to get to if we aren't able to sort of get in front of this sooner than later. So my feeling is just the more everyone can say it's important, the more everybody can support the really smart people who are focused on attacking this problem from a scientific standpoint and an environmental standpoint, the better off we're all going to be.
Brian,
And of course, I don't think I'm repeating anything that most of us don't always agree. We need this to be a nonpartisan issue. This can't be about politics. It's about the survival of our planet, and if that's not enough, the significant economic impacts that are going to come from the devastation that large scale climate change can create.
Brian, thank you for your time. We appreciate it.
Thank you for having me. Appreciate the attention, and hope that everyone out there will continue to do their parts. Thanks, Kevin.